Hey everyone, and welcome back. My name is Mackenzie, aka Astromac, and I'm a professional astrologer, and I talk all things astrology on this channel. And today we are diving deep into the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. That sign that is fiery and expansive, and the truth seeker, and the philosopher, and the explorer, all wrapped into one. Sagittarius is kind of like the wild card of the zodiac that just wants, seeking freedom. And so it's an energy that refuses to stay boxed in. It wants meaning and it wants adventure and it wants to understand the bigger picture and what it all means. And so if you want to understand this fiery and expansive sign on a much deeper level, then this is your Sagittarius 101 video. So Sagittarius is the 9th sign of the zodiac, following the deep and intense and mysterious and magnetic and powerful sign of Scorpio. Sagittarius is the mutable fire sign of the zodiac that is ruled by Jupiter, and so it's like this excitable and enthusiastic and inspired sign being a fire sign, but it's also changeable and adaptable and flexible being a mutable sign. And then that Jupiter rulership makes it like this really big and expansive and abundant energy as well. And so it's in Sagittarius where we take that deep transformation and evolution that we went through during Scorpio season, and we turn it into wisdom, and we find the deeper meaning in it all. And, we open ourselves up to new possibilities and visions and goals for the future. And so if Scorpio was all about going deep into that emotional underworld and, confronting our shadows and confronting the hard stuff and really regenerating from a cellular level, now it's in Sagittarius, it's okay, now that I survived all of that and I survived that emotional excavation, now I need to climb my way or gallop my way out of that deep water and really try to figure out, what the hell it all meant. And so in Scorpio, we dive deep, and then in Sagittarius, we shift our focus, upwards and towards that horizon. It's kind of after that deep dive, we're really gifted with this adventurous and expansive and abundant and these wisdom-filled teachings, really bringing faith and hope back to our lives. And so it's like that arrow that's pointing upwards and outwards towards that horizon, really guiding us back towards the light throughout Sagittarius season. And so Sagittarius is the part of the zodiac wheel where we need movement, and we need this sense of adventure, and we're growing and learning and expanding, and this feeling of anything is possible. Because it's where we're seeking meaning and seeking freedom and seeking those higher truths. And really, it's where we need to say yes to opportunities. I tend to always think of Sagittarius as being this leap of faith kind of energy where it's constantly asking itself, what's next? And so they need this sense of looking forward to something and moving forward, and they're going on an adventure or a quest or a journey. And, it has to be directed at something because, think about when you're shooting an arrow, you need a target. And so whether you have Sagittarius placements or not, you still have Sagittarius somewhere in your chart. And so all of us has Sagittarius energy somewhere inside of us. And so for me, I don't have any planets in the sign of Sagittarius, but I do have Sagittarius on my 7th house. And so this Sagittarius energy tends to manifest through my relationships, and it tends to be an energy that I attract within my relationships. And it tends to describe those people that I have those close one-on-one relationships with as well. And so wherever you have Sagittarius in your own chart, tends to be an area of life where it's you need to kind of spread your wings and learn how to fly and expand your horizons there, whether it's mentally learning and philosophizing about this area of life, or actual physical travel and going to different cultures and experiencing different cultures and different ways of living and different ways of finding meaning and philosophizing about that. And so archetypally, Sagittarius is the traveler and the explorer and the wanderer and the nomad, but then it's also the philosopher and the wise sage, and it's also the teacher and the preacher, and it's just this, they're the truth seekers. It's basically this archetype of seeking more. And so it's a sign that is always looking upwards and outwards, towards the future. And so these are very visionary type people. And it's this energy that really wants to like expand consciousness and expand forward like a bow and arrow. Even just looking at its glyph, it's that arrow that is pointed upwards and forwards towards the future. And so whenever I think of Sagittarius, I tend to imagine like this arrow that is really like soaring through this open sky, really conveying this sense of possibility and excitement and enthusiasm and like this feeling that like, anything is possible. And as it's soaring through the sky, it has this orientation towards the future and like it's going somewhere. It's not staying in one place, it's expanding and moving and going somewhere. And so with Sagittarius, it's not always about like the end goal, although Sagittarius does tend to be a very goal-oriented sign when they can find that target that they're aiming towards. But mostly with Sagittarius, it's all about like the journey they took to get there. And that doesn't have to mean like, physical travels and physical journeys. Although I do tend to know a lot of Sagittarius placements who do love to travel, but, it can also express as like journeys of the mind, like these never ending learning journeys where it's just like, trying to seek meaning in life. And so there's definitely like a metaphorical journey to the sign, and it can manifest as like physical journeys and traveling and like taking the scenic route, but it can also be like these inner journeys where it's through this journey and whether it be physical or mental that we are like seeking this meaning and really trying to discover ourselves along the way. And on this journey, it's like we're gathering knowledge and gathering experience and moving from, one belief to another, or one religion to another, or, one philosophy to another, because Sagittarius governs like these big picture ideas. And so that includes our beliefs, both like, spiritual or religious or even political. And it's also like just our philosophy on life. And again, being ruled by Jupiter, Sagittarius is into like these big ideas, not so much like the tiny details of life. Like with Gemini, they would be happy to bounce from like idea to idea and topic to topic and have all the conversations and gather all the information that way, like a bee or a hummingbird going flower to flower, like, collecting pollen and distributing it that way. Whereas, Sagittarius would rather sit back and philosophize or, go out and travel and experience things firsthand and really try to make meaning of things that way and, turn that experience into wisdom and, philosophize and reflect on the journey they took to get there. And it's really all about like this path or this quest for discovery. And I always think of the hero's journey when I think of Sagittarius. It's probably something that they really resonate with as well, because I find that a lot of Sagittarians feel like they've almost been given like this mythical task or a quest where it feels like, they're given a special or divine mission in life. I haven't mentioned it yet, but they are the Centaur in the Zodiac, which is the half man, half horse. And so they are kind of like these mythical creatures in a way. And so throughout this quest and this journey that they're on, they're able to like, find meaning in all of it. Like, even the obstacles they might welcome, because they're able to like savor each and every step of that journey and really finding a way to, even make meaning of the obstacles and like, what is the meaning in this and how can I learn from this and turn this experience into wisdom. And so through this journey, they're able to explore and question things and kind of bring in their own higher perspective through this Sagittarius filter. So no matter what kind of journey Sagittarius is going on, it's all for this purpose of like seeking meaning and expanding and, seeing what's next and trying to move yourself upwards and forwards, because, it's the sign that is always reaching for something that is beyond what's right in front of them. They really need like this feeling of movement, because when they don't have that feeling of movement, whether it's like, they haven't been learning something new, or maybe they haven't traveled in a while, or it doesn't feel like they're on some kind of quest, or it doesn't feel like they're chasing something meaningful, it can be very depleting for Sagittarius placements. Like, Sag placements need like this feeling of like they're on a mission or on an adventure. They also need to be able to not take themselves so seriously. Like, this is a sign that really needs to make space for them to be able to, joke around and be silly and go on these fun adventures and just play and, have fun. And Sagittarius tend to have like the most hilarious sense of humor, like these are the big personalities in the room. And so they tend to be really fun and so funny. Like, you know, when someone enters a room and they just seem to like, you know, take up space, even if they're like a small person, or, you know, it's like they just have like this really big aura or energy to them. Like, you know, that's usually someone with Sagittarius placements. Because when they're not like taking themselves so seriously and taking life so seriously, it's kind of like they add like a buoyancy to any room that they're in, because they're just like, you know, these people that love to have fun and lots of it. So much so that they don't know when to stop sometimes. Because something that I don't think is talked about enough when it comes to Sagittarius is how they can really be affected by things like depression. And it's kind of like the irony of Sagittarius, because it's the sign that's associated with like being super optimistic. And it's because of that it's like, you know, when that bubble gets burst, they can be really affected by that. Like when they lose that childlike wonder, they can get really depressed. Because it's really like this joy and this exuberance and this enthusiasm and like this zest for life that really fuels Sagittarius. And so they need that sense of hope and optimism to, you know, stay energized. And so it's like if water gets thrown on their fire and like that zest for life, you know, they can really struggle. Even as much as Capricorn, who's kind of used to like that cold hard reality. And so Capricorn placements can kind of be like, you know, that's just life and life is difficult. Whereas Sagittarius has this more like wide-eyed, optimistic, like enthusiastic, and anything is possible kind of lens. And so it can really struggle when, you know, they don't know what's next and they don't feel like they have something that they're like aiming towards and something that they feel like they're on this like journey or adventure or quest. And so if you're a Sagittarius out there and you find yourself struggling, you know, try giving yourself a little quest. And it can be even like little side quests and something as small as like, you know, going to a different coffee shop, or, you know, going to your local library, or trying out a new walking path, you know, just switching things up. Really what you want to do is kind of like, you know, find those things that you're deeply passionate about and those things that interest you and those things that you can't seem to get enough of. Again, just like finding something to aim towards, even if it's small at first, like those small targets, even if it's like, you know, something as small as signing up for like a workshop here and there, or like a course that interests you. Anything that gets you back on like this quest and adventure and playful mindset. Sagittarius is also very like opportunistic and experiential, and it's like they do things for the experience, and it's like they're doing it for the memoir or for the lore. They actually tend to learn best by like, you know, firsthand experience. And so it's like, you know, they learn how to swim by being tossed in the water, or they learn how to fly by being pushed out of the nest. And so they're usually not very afraid of like trying new things. And so where Gemini likes to get all their facts through like the processing of information and reading and writing and listening and, you know, all those kinds of things, Sagittarius really lives for that experiential kind of learning where it's like they get fully immersed. And so they're kind of like these eternal students of life. And I think that's like that Gemini Sagittarius polarity. But in Sagittarius, it comes from this space of like, you know, wanting to expand your awareness and expand their consciousness and really kind of explore those things that really feed their spirit and really energizes them in a way that makes them want to continue living, really. And so thinking back to the archetypes, you know, again, they are the explorer and the wanderer and the adventurer, and then they are also like that student that turns into the teacher. And then from there, it's like they become these philosophers and these preachers who really share their knowledge and share their wisdom that they gained through all of these different life experiences. It's kind of like they've gone on all of these quests and these journeys and had these expanding experiences on this search for truth and this search for higher meaning. And then it's like, you know, okay, I don't want to just sit with all of this by myself. Because to them, it feels like there's no point in like knowing all of these things if you don't share what you've learned and share what you know and share that wisdom and put it out into the world. And so that's why these are like the teachers and the preachers of the world, and like the wise sages and the authors and the mentors. And, you know, I tend to always think of Robert Hand, who's the author of all of these books up here, he's actually Sagittarius, and it was his birthday yesterday. But I tend to always think of him because he definitely shares what he knows. And so it's just this energy of like sharing your wisdom with the world. And so one way I tend to think of like the Sagittarius evolution or, you know, journey that they go on throughout their life is how they kind of start off as like this fearless traveler who wants to go on an adventure. And so it's kind of like they're fresh out of high school and they spontaneously decide, like, let's travel the world and like, let's go out and have all these expanding experiences and make these drunken mistakes, because it's this feeling of like, experiencing freedom for the first time. And Sagittarius are definitely like the free spirits of the zodiac who kind of like, go where the wind takes them. And then after they've had all of these like expanding new experiences, then it's like they're ready to become the student again. And whether it's like they go to college and university and kind of, follow their calling that way, or they get a new job and they become the new student that way, where it's like they're learning new skills. And then it's not like it stops there. This is something that they continue, whether it's, signing up for courses and, upskilling and following their passion and learning all they can about whatever is, calling to them. Because again, this is a sign that needs that movement, and it needs to feel like it's continually learning and continually expanding, and just like this feeling of this movement forward. Then it's like they reach a point where it's like the lessons of the explorer and the student merge together into the philosopher, where they begin to ask themselves, like, what is the meaning of this experiential life I have lived so far? And so it's kind of like the philosopher is really fueled by the experiences of life and like the lessons that they've learned as this explorer and the student. And so whenever I think of Sagittarius, I tend to think of like, these adventurers and these explorers and these travelers who just want to experience a different way of living and a different way of experiencing life. And so they travel to these places in order to be fully immersed in the culture and really, experience the dance and the music and the food and the different ways of, different belief systems and different ways of experiencing life. And, they like to experience like, the history and the art and the architecture and, all of that. They want to be fully immersed in it to experience it firsthand. And then I also think of like these avid learners and these academics who are really eager to like philosophize about everything from like religion to politics and spiritual beliefs and all kinds of different belief systems and even other cultures and ways of being and even like, things like art and science. But Sagittarius's primary objective is really like this sense of faith and optimism and expansion and freedom. And, these are like the ruling energies of this sign. It's like the Sagittarius mode of operation is to live life as if it's an adventure and to move forward expecting miracles and to take that leap of faith and say yes to these expanding new experiences. And as they are on this expanding experience, they are asking those big questions like, why are we here? And what's the meaning of life? And what's the purpose? And what's the meaning behind all of this, And they ask these big questions because they're ruled by Jupiter, that planet that is all about seeking meaning and making meaning of our experience. And, Jupiter is also the largest planet in our solar system. And so it's kind of like Sagittarius was born to ask these big questions, but also just like, be big and have this like big energy. There's just such a like larger than life quality that Sagittarius placements have. And that doesn't mean that there aren't like shy and introverted Sagittariuses, because, there definitely are, but they have like this bigness and this sense of expansion and like this larger than life quality within them. It's just a matter of how they go about expressing this bigness that really depends on like the house placement and all the aspects and all that fun stuff. But again, they just have like this big energy and they have like these big ideas. And so they see things in like this more big picture way. And so they can be quite visionary in that way, but they're not so much good at like the tiny details of things like Gemini or Virgo. Like they don't always think of like, the small steps that it takes to get to, wherever they're going. They're kind of like, can't we just skip 15 steps and get there already? So seasonally with Sagittarius being a mutable sign, that means it's a sign that straddles seasons. And so it straddles the fall and the winter months. And so it kind of has qualities of both. So seasonally, this tends to be the time of year where we're like, thinking about the future. We might be reflecting on like having those end of year reflections where it's like, okay, this is where I was this time last year. And, now where do I want to go into the future? And so we tend to have like these big visions and these big dreams for ourselves before we actually set like those New Year's intentions. We may even start making like travel plans to go back to our hometowns for the holidays, or, even thinking about like those belief systems that we may have been raised with and, like where we are now. And so it's kind of like all of this comes alive during Sagittarius season. So during Sagittarius season, we're being invited to reflect on, like, where are we headed next, and what kind of story do you want to write for yourself over the course of the next year? And I was trying to think about how Sagittarius could, like, fit in with like my plant analogy, but the thing is that during Sagittarius season, like, pretty much all of the plants have died at this point, and there aren't really any plants growing during these winter months. And so I was thinking about how it's like the birds and the squirrels who are, eating the seeds of these plants and then, scattering them to be, buried in the dirt where they can, hibernate for the winter and then eventually grow into plants during the spring again. And so it's like that act of scattering the seeds and, sometimes getting out of the neighborhood and that local environment, and it could end up like, all the way across town. But seasonally, I was thinking about how this is the season where it's like, the geese and, all kinds of other birds and, other animals start migrating south for the winter. And that act of migration just felt very Sagittarius to me, where it's like, you're getting out of your environment and you're traveling far and wide and expanding your horizons and having these new experiences. And I'm not really sure how birds know where and when to migrate. I think they are very intuitive and instinctual beings, very much like Sagittarius, but it's kind of like they just go where the wind takes them and they don't know where they might end up, and that feels very Sagittarius to me. And I'm lucky enough that I get to be surrounded by nature, and so I get to observe nature a lot. And so that was what jumped out most to me, is like, this is migration season. So like I said earlier, Sagittarius is the mutable fire sign of the zodiac. And so as a fire sign, it's excitable and enthusiastic and passionate and inspired, bold energy. But as a mutable sign, it's more like, changeable and flexible and adaptable and restless and, always in motion. And so this is actually the third fire sign that we've met in my zodiac series, and actually the last fire sign, which is crazy to think about, but the first two being Aries and Leo. And in Aries, it's cardinal fire, and so it's like this initiating fire, and I always think of like the lighting of a match or like that spark of life. And so it's this energy that really expresses in like these short bursts, like the sprinter. And, it's also like, Aries expresses its will, being ruled by Mars. And so this is kind of like that leader who just really takes charge into battle. And then in Leo, this is fixed fire. So it's sustained fire that people kind of gather around, like a bonfire or a fireplace. And being ruled by the sun, it's kind of like Leo is expressive of its identity, and it expresses like its personality and its sense of creativity. Leo is associated with royalty, and so it's kind of like this is the king or a leader of a kingdom. But now in Sagittarius, this is mutable fire, so it's movable fire. So one way to think about it is it's kind of like the embers that are left over after a fire, or like, that flame that's like burning still under the ashes, where it's like, this smoldering fire that can really grow into something more. And so it's fire that can be moved, like taking those embers and taking it to your fireplace or your neighbor's fireplace and really spreading the fire that way, and spreading the warmth and spreading that inspiration and spreading that enthusiasm and spreading the passion and knowledge and even inspiring others in that way. Because it's like Sagittarius is not afraid to move ideas, and they want to push ideas forward and really see what they'll grow into. And so a lot of times they're drawn to these bigger subjects again, and they're kind of like those even provocative subjects that really push the envelope forward. Things like religion and politics and beliefs and belief systems and spiritual beliefs and, other cultures and other philosophies and just different ways of experiencing life, because again, they are the truth seekers and they are seeking a higher meaning. So they tend to be very vocal, and they tend to be very expressive of their beliefs and like their knowledge and their wisdom that they've gained throughout their life experience. And so these tend to be the leaders who lead through inspiration and through their ideas and through their beliefs. And so Sagittarius really wants to expand their consciousness, or expand this fire further and, move it forward. But like all things, like too much of one thing can lead to an excess, and that's something that Sagittarius is definitely prone to, is like excess of all things. And so in terms of like the Sagittarius fire, I also tend to think of like a forest fire when it comes to Sagittarius, where it's like, sometimes they just don't know when to stop. because Sagittarius is all about expansion. And so forest fire really helps illustrate like the wildness and like the free spirit of Sagittarius, where it's kind of like, they just go where the wind takes them. They really, really don't like trying to be controlled or contained. Sagittarius needs freedom, and so they can get really claustrophobic if like someone is trying to like put them in a box. And so it's like they really need this unconstrained freedom and just room to breathe. And so if you can think about a forest fire in like a positive way, that's Sagittarius, where it's just like expanding and growing and chasing and consuming and, seeking new horizons. And it's not so much about like, sustained fire, that's Leo, but it's like this energy of, I want to go everywhere and I want to experience all the things and I want to explore different ideas and explore new horizons. It's that kind of energy. And so it's going to spread itself out, it wants to be well distributed and well diversified, and all the while it's seeking meaning and it's seeking experience and it's seeking knowledge. And so if you can just think of it as like this expansive fire that, doesn't necessarily have to cause destruction or devastation, because, that's not so much the Sagittarius. Although with this proclivity to excess and, not knowing when to stop, sometimes Sagittarius can, create quite a destructive path. But that's when they don't really have like a goal in mind and, a target that they're shooting towards. It's kind of like they're just, here to have fun and have a good time. You got to have some goals as well. Because also, like I said earlier, like Sagittarius is a very experiential sign, where it's like they do things for the experience of it and they do things for the lore. And it's a sign that's all about, like taking the scenic route and all about the journey they take to get there. But, most importantly, they really need to find like that inner guiding compass. Otherwise, they're going to scatter their energy and drain their energy. And that inner guiding compass tends to be like that inner thing that they're just like the most passionate about, that they just can't get enough of, that they love thinking about and they love philosophizing about. And so another way to understand the Sagittarius fire is to, think about like the night sky and like that brightest star in the distance. Stars are these burning balls of fire, and so it's kind of like Sagittarius needs to find their North Star that they're shooting towards and aiming towards. Because once a Sagittarius finds their North Star, they can really become like these truly unstoppable forces. And if anyone or anything tries to, contain them or get in the way, they will really burn that person or that thing right down. Because remember, these are like the freedom seekers and they really can't be contained, because they're kind of like the free spirits where, you can never quite pin them down. And the thing about Sagittarius is they're going to keep growing and expanding. And so when they can find that North Star, it's kind of like they can really thrive and, be these unstoppable forces in that direction. And so when they can follow that North Star and follow those things that they're deeply passionate about, that's when like that zest and that vigor and that enthusiasm for life just kind of returns to them. It doesn't mean that the journey's going to be easy, but when they can have that North Star that they're constantly aiming towards, that makes the Sagittarius life a little easier. Otherwise, again, they're going to scatter their energy, and that might lead to things like burnout. And actually, look at the glyph. It's an arrow pointed upwards and outwards. And again, like I said earlier, when you're shooting an arrow, you tend to want to have like a target in mind. And so that target is that North Star. And actually, in mythology, Sagittarius is often linked with the Centaur, who is like the half man and half horse. And I kind of love this symbolism because I really feel like it captures the Sagittarius energy really well, where it's like, they're galloping in this direction and they're traveling fast and like they're expanding in a certain direction. And all the while they're holding this bow and arrow trying to like shoot at these targets and shoot at these goals. Again, it's mutable fire. And so it's like this traveling energy, but it's also goal driven and it's expanding constantly. I also think it's cool that Sagittarius is represented by like this mythical creature because with Sagittarius, again, it's kind of like they're on this hero's journey where they're, meeting these battles and having to overcome these obstacles and meeting other mythical creatures along the way and other people who unlock certain paths and bring like, these hidden keys and, they're having to fight off these other, mythical beasts and just going on like this fantastical quest where it's like they're finding meaning. And again, it's all about the journey. And so they themselves like to envision that they're in like this fantastical story of their making. And being these mythical creatures, I kind of feel like this goes along with how, the sky is the limit when it comes to Sagittarius, where it's like nothing is too big and nothing is too out of reach for them. And this is like their superpower. It's kind of like, once they have that goal in mind and that North Star, nothing is going to get in their way. And so being the Centaur, it's kind of like you've got this wild animal and instinctual fire on the bottom, and then on the top you've got like, the human intellect and the human consciousness really aiming that arrow towards something. That something usually being like a higher meaning or, a higher truth. And both parts are important when it comes to Sagittarius because, Sagittarians are very instinctual and they kind of, follow those impulses and they can be spontaneous in that way. And so a lot of times, they need to learn to trust those instincts when they are, presented with an opportunity or a quest or a journey and really aim that arrow in that direction that they feel like that, yes, And the arrow is important when it comes to, the Centaur and it's holding that arrow because, Sagittarius, it really can to like shoot randomly. It really needs to, again, have that target. And that target can be like, seeking a higher meaning and seeking a higher truth, or when it's aimed at like growth and wisdom. Because even when Sagittarius appears to be, running from something, it's usually running towards a bigger picture and like a bigger dream and a bigger vision for the future. And so the message of the Centaur is to really, look up and look forward and look to the higher meaning and the wisdom. Things like truth and hope and optimism and faith are all achieved with like this upwards gaze. Think about in Scorpio season how we were being asked to, look in and look deep down. But it's like, now in Sagittarius, we're being invited to, look up and outwards again. Looking out at the horizon and looking at like, oh, what's out there? I wonder what's out there. Let's explore this. And looking at all the potential possibilities and potential pathways it takes to get there. And so with Sagittarius, it's kind of like you want to be making these choices and these decisions out of faith and not fear, and really having faith in yourself and believing in yourself that you will make the right decisions. And so it's like we're kind of using that arrow again where we're pointing it at trying to make a meaningful life for ourselves. And so that makes me think of Jupiter's rulership as well. And Jupiter is that planet of expansion and growth and abundance and generosity and higher learning and seeking meaning. And Jupiter doesn't play small. It's kind of like that planet that more is more is more is more. I always think of a magnifying glass when I think of Jupiter that tends to, expand whatever it touches. And so when we think about it in terms of the Sagittarius rulership, it's all about like, more ideas and more travel and more philosophies and more experiences and more beliefs and more possibilities. Again, it's all about this sense of like expansion and just like this bigness, and it just really adds like this larger than life quality to Sagittarius. Think about Jupiter as a planet. It's the largest planet in our solar system. And I think that you can fit like, over 1,000 Earths inside of Jupiter. Like it's massive. And I think it also acts as like Earth's protector in a way where it kind of shields us from potential asteroids or, other comets, because it just has such a like massive gravitational pull to it. And so anything within range to its gravitational field just like, gets really sucked in. And then once it gets into Jupiter's atmosphere, I'm pretty sure it just like, disintegrates. And so it's kind of like Sagittarius has this air of protection about them, being ruled by Jupiter, where, they can just be kind of like, happy-go-lucky, where they can just, take that leap of faith and, be that free spirit, where they just have this awareness where it's like, they know they are divinely protected. And I think that's why Sagittarius is also associated with things like luck. Like some of the Sagittarians that I know personally are like some of the luckiest people I've ever met, where it's like, they just leave a situation just in the nick of time, or, they get opportunities presented to them, or they're just like in the right place at the right time. And, anybody else in their situation would like, end up getting arrested or getting injured or, whatever it might be. It's like Sagittarius has this happy-go-lucky energy where it's kind of like they're able to walk away from situations unfazed and unscathed. And that's not to say that, bad things don't happen to Sagittarians, because, bad things happen to everyone, but they do have like a more like lucky energy. Now, depending on what sign their Jupiter is in, depends on, what kind of luck they have and what kind of protector and what kind of abundance they have. Jupiter adds like a generous quality to Sagittarius as well, where it's like, they want to share their abundance and they want to share their wisdom and they want to share their knowledge and their life experience. And again, it just comes from this space of like abundance and like, cup floweth over type of energy. So that's why Sagittarius is associated with like, the teachers and the professors and, the preachers and the wise sages and the mentors and, these authors who publish these great works. I always think of Jupiter as being just like this jovial and enthusiastic spirit that just really wants to lift other people's spirits. I think I like heard somewhere, I can't remember where, but I heard that, Jupiter is kind of like the Santa Claus of our solar system. Like think of how Santa Claus like travels the world in one night and how it's kind of like this mythical being who, eats all the cookies and is so giving and generous, just wanting to share the abundance. That's kind of like that Sagittarius energy, and also like this sense of optimism where, they think that they can travel the world in one night. Sometimes they bite off more than they can chew, but also, also like that proclivity to excess where, they eat all the cookies. And so again, Jupiter is just like this more is more planet that is like a magnifying lens that sometimes doesn't know when to stop. And so that is very Sagittarian to me. So I know this has been a lot to take in, so let's briefly bring it back to basics and kind of summarize everything that we've covered so far. And so Sagittarius is the mutable fire sign of the zodiac. And so being a fire sign, it makes it, fiery and bold and inspired and driven by passion. And so this is the sign that really thrives on, things like movement and enthusiasm and that feeling of, adventure and going on a journey. And that feeling of movement that it needs is really indicated by it being a mutable sign. And, mutable signs are the changeable signs that need to be flexible and they need to be adaptable. And, that movement also, I think, expresses itself by, this need to travel and also shift ideas and shift beliefs and, constantly seek these new experiences and new perspectives. And so being mutable fire, it makes it movable fire. And so you can think about, again, like those embers in a fire that you can, move it from one fire to the next and, spreading that passion and spreading those ideas and spreading like that enthusiasm to others in that way. Or again, you could think about like the forest fire and how it's just like this expansive energy that loves to consume things and take it all in, and it goes where the wind takes it. Where it just like, wants to expand its mind and expand its horizons and, go anywhere and everywhere. Or again, you could think of like a shooting star or that North Star in the distance that's just like represents that target that you're aiming towards and continually growing towards. And Sagittarius is ruled by the planet Jupiter, which is that planet of growth and abundance and expansion and faith and our beliefs and how we seek meaning in the world. And so Jupiter really gives Sagittarius like, this bigness, like that big quality that they have where they just have like this big energy and they have these big ideas and this desire to expand and go further and learn more and believe in new possibilities and to believe in things that kind of, go beyond your current horizons. Like I always think of, earlier explorers, how they used to think that the world was flat. And so they, all they saw was ocean. And so they just believed that something was beyond there and they followed that. I think this rulership is also why Sagittarius is associated with luck, where they can just be like these happy-go-lucky personalities and free spirits, and also like this sense of abundance and optimism that they have, and this sense of, seeking opportunities and seeking meanings beyond what's just in front of them, And then their symbolism that they are represented by is the Centaur, which is a half man and half horse and often depicted holding a bow and arrow. And so this represents like that blend of instincts as well as intellect that is Sagittarius. And so it's kind of like, this raw drive to really seek out a higher meaning and a higher truth and just like a wider understanding. And centaurs are these mythical beings that are known for being like these wise, benevolent figures. And the arrow that a centaur is holding is almost always depicted of, this arrow being shot upwards and outwards, symbolizing that Sagittarius hunger for, wisdom and knowledge and experience and truth and purpose and just like that next adventure. And that's actually what the glyph is. It's that bow and arrow, and it's that arrow that's being shot upwards and outwards, and it's soaring through the air and, seeking meaning. Now let's talk about the strengths and potential challenges that these Sagittarians may experience because, no sign is perfect all the time, including Sagittarius. And so at its best, Sagittarius is adventurous and spontaneous and honest and wise and fun and funny and deeply philosophical and intelligent. Like, these are the people that you want to have at like a dinner party or really any kind of party because, they're just like great storytellers and they've got a lot of, life experience where they can tell a great story and, they've got that wisdom as well. Now, they may exaggerate their stories a little bit, but that's all in the name of telling a great story. And they've got that Jupiterian ability to really like draw people in with just like their enthusiasm and their passion and their excitement and just like this zest for life. And again, they've just got like this really big, great energy, and they can really just be like the life of the party. They are just like the most fun, and they can turn any kind of event or gathering into a fun time and into a party. So again, they just love to have fun and they love to have a good time and they love to laugh. And so they have a great sense of humor. Like, these are the people who can talk about like the meaning of life and what does it all mean and really talk about these huge, like hard to comprehend topics. And then they can be like, pulling jokes and like pulling pranks the next minute. They can also be very inspirational and motivational as well with like, this enthusiasm when they're coming from the right space. Because usually these are the people who have had like a wide range of experiences. And when they have these experiences, they like to be fully immersed so they can, experience it fully. And through these experiences, they come to learn things, whether it's like, learning things about the world or learning things about themselves. Then a lot of times they like to share what they've learned and, share that wisdom and share their philosophy on life, which can be very motivational to others. And so like, these are kind of like the self-help authors or like the motivational speaker type of people where, they're kind of like, learn from my experience. And they can be very like, this is what helped me when I was going through this thing, and let me show you how to use this thing in order to better your life and make it better. They also have like this jovial optimism that can be very uplifting, and they like to make sure that they're like including everyone, and they like to like bring everyone in. They're like, okay, group hug everyone, Again, there's just like a generosity with Sagittarius where they want to like share their wisdom and share what they know and share the wealth and share that abundance. Whether it's like this abundance of love or abundance of money or abundance of, whatever, and just like sharing their experience. These people also tend to be very well read because like they're, the eternal student where they like to read everything that they can and follow that passion. And they tend to also be very cultured as well, where they like to travel and experience different cultures. And so Sagittarius is really that energy that like raises the bar on what any of us thought could be possible. Now, some potential challenges that Sagittarius might face when they're feeling like, under-resourced or insecure, because again, no sign is perfect, and so that's kind of when like those shadowy qualities come out when we're feeling insecure. Sagittarius can be very blunt sometimes, where it's like they just want to be honest, and so they might say that thing that hurts your feelings, and it might come across as being rude, but they're like, oh, I'm just being honest. And they may not always be able to be truthful with themselves, but they'll be truthful with you. And so these are the people who will tell you that hard truth that you might need to hear. They can also come across as being like know-it-alls or very dogmatic, where it's like they think that they're always right, and like they think that their idea is like the best idea that there ever was. And so they might think that they know everything, and so they can just like sit back and be all philosophical now. And so sometimes that can come across as being like over the top, where they like think they are this expert in some field. But, this quality also makes them good leaders because people tend to look to them for like these answers and for their wisdom and for their experiences. So sometimes they may just need to be checked and put in their place or humbled a little bit. They're also known for like, getting on their soapbox a little bit and, getting preachy, and there might even be like a judgmental tone where they might kind of like get on their high horse a little bit and be like, oh, I would never do that. So these can be like the zealots of the world, where they can be really dogmatic and like self-righteous and even hypocritical, where they can be very like my way or the highway and I'm right and there's no room for anyone else's opinion. And then they might like go on to preach about like, you need to be open-minded, when it's like, actually no, you need to be open-minded. And so sometimes they're not the best at like, reading the room. They can also be pretty impulsive with like this desire to be a free spirit and spontaneous, but sometimes that can even be reckless because they might just feel like they're living in the moment, but it's kind of like they become these adrenaline junkies sometimes. They also have a tendency to kind of like overpromise and overextend and then disappear when things get too heavy or they feel too confining. Like they might kind of initiate these projects or these relationships because it sounds like a good idea in the moment and it sounds like it'll be fun and exciting and expansive. But then when it gets down to like the details of things and things get more serious, they can kind of be like, I'm gonna bounce, I'm out of here. And so they can be pretty like non-committal, which I think is why Capricorn comes next. Because they're just more focused on like the big picture and like the adventure and like that bigger idea, and so they can overlook some of those really important details and then bite off more than they can chew. And so if you need like help doing something like mundane, Sagittarius maybe isn't your person. These are more like your visionaries and your ideas people and like that person that you want to like go on an adventure with. Those are your people. But when it comes down to like, helping you do the little things, maybe choose a Virgo. So because they are so focused on like what's upwards and what's out there, that can sometimes lead to them being a little bit like head in the clouds. And sometimes they can also have like this main character syndrome, similar to Leo, where it's like, they think that they're the only one on like this life quest and that everybody else is just kind of like the side characters. So they forget that, everyone else is like having their own life experiences and they're all on their own different life quests. And then as they're focused on like that bigger idea or that bigger picture, they can kind of get a little bit lost with like that arrow just like soaring through the air. And so they're not always best with dealing with reality. And so I think that's why Capricorn comes next as well. And so really at its core, I really think that Sagittarius means well, but they just really don't like being confined or trapped because they need that sense of freedom and room to breathe and grow. And so the evolutionary meaning of Sagittarius is that they're really here to broaden their horizons and discover their higher meaning in life. And so they will journey far and wide through travel as well as like through philosophy and education in this quest for meaning and, finding that deeper truth. And then after they've gone on this long journey of expanding their horizons and expanding their mind and having all of these experiences and learning from these experiences and turning it into wisdom, it's kind of like it's their role to really teach us all that they've learned, especially those lessons and those beliefs that life has meaning, like even when things don't make sense and it doesn't really feel like it. So Sagittarius helps to remind us that all of our experiences, like the good and the bad, are all shaping who we are and shaping our own philosophy and meaning in life. And so Sagittarius is the seeker and the teacher and the truth teller and the explorer of the world and ideas. And it's the part of you that like refuses to give up on meaning, even when life gets hard. And so, like all signs, Sagittarius plays a very important role. And hopefully I've helped you understand that role on a much deeper level today. And yeah, that has been my Sagittarius 101 video. And next up in this Zodiac 101 series, we move into Capricorn, which is, that sign that is all about reality, and it's the builder and like that wise crone type of energy that is the mountain climber. And so stay tuned for that. And I think that's all I've got to say for now. So if you stuck around this long, thank you so much for watching, and maybe comment down below if you have any Sagittarius placements and if any of this resonated. And yeah, thanks for watching, and until next time, love you, bye!